We continue now in our study of John in chapter 11, and beginning here in verse 1. Now, a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. Now, you find here that John does not tell us the length of time that transpired between the Feast of Dedication, where we left off basically last time in late December, and this event. No, it just says, now a certain man. So he just picks the story up. Whether this was a few weeks, whether this was possibly a couple of months, again, we're just not told. However, based on the events that are recorded in the synoptic accounts, when you go through the synoptics and you put together what took place before Passover, this probably took place sometime in early February. That would be my guess because of what has to transpire, and we'll come to some of that a little later on. Now, John wrote his gospel account that we have here with the assumption, obviously, that his readers were very familiar with the details of the synoptic accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because he wrote this sometime after. All of those had been in circulation for at least 30 years by the time John completed this work and began to publish it, or not publish it, but at least the material that John wrote to be distributed. Here, in verse 1, he presumes that the reader is knowledgeable of Mary and Martha, because he says a town of Mary and her sister Martha. Obviously, you should know these two individuals because of the way he introduces them. Now, Luke records an earlier event concerning the two sisters, when, if you'll remember, Martha became very upset with Mary because Mary would not come and help her in the kitchen. They had all kinds of guests there, and she needed some help, and Mary sat at Jesus' feet, enthralled with what he was teaching. And so Martha says, she needs to help me instead of sitting there listening to you. And of course, we know Jesus corrected her back there in Luke chapter 10. Lazarus. We covered Lazarus, or the name Lazarus, back in Luke. Lazarus and the rich man, in the bosom of Abraham and so forth and so on. This is not the same Lazarus by any means. But the name Lazarus is the Greek equivalent to the Hebrew name Eleazar. So we should be familiar with that. Eleazar, which means whom God helps. Who is helped by El. Okay. Which again, whom God helps. This very fitting name for what Jesus would do for this man. Something only God can do. God can raise him from the dead. Jesus was going to do that. In verse 2, it was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Now, this is another one of John's parenthetical insertions that he gives us, and in this case, he's referring to a future event which would occur. In fact, we'll get to it in chapter 12, but it would occur less than a week before Jesus would be crucified and then ultimately put to death. Verse 3, therefore, now that, again, going back to verse 1 after the insertion here, a certain man, Lazarus, was sick. Therefore, his sisters, or the sisters, Mary and Martha, sent to Jesus, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love, here the Greek word is phileo. Phileo. He whom you love is sick. Now, since Jesus had openly displayed affection or love, phileo, for Lazarus, it becomes very clear here that he had spent enough time with these three siblings, Lazarus and his two sisters, to develop a deep friendship with them. It's likely that he had relied on their hospitality whenever he came up to Jerusalem in order to keep the festivals. It seems that he must have stayed with Lazarus and his sisters. And the indication also from what we read and know about them, the tomb and so forth, Lazarus must have been a fairly wealthy man. He could afford a tomb. Only the rich could afford a tomb. And so he probably had a large enough area, big courtyard in the middle, so that when Jesus and the disciples came, they would have a place to stay there while they were, again, at the festival in Jerusalem. Of course, it's about a 2-mile walk from Bethany, but you need exercise. And 2 miles is not too much in each direction to walk in a day. Verse 4, when Jesus heard that, the message that was sent by the sisters, he said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. There's something very special that's going to happen when it says that he's going to be glorified through it. Now, we don't find here that Jesus said or denied that Lazarus would die. He did not deny, did not say he would not die. But the sickness is not unto death. That is, he simply stated here that the sickness would not permanently end Lazarus' physical life. He said that because he knew what the Father had already willed him to do in order to prove to all of mankind who is the Savior, the deliverer from death. Verse 5, now Jesus loved. Here the word in the Greek is agapeo. Agapeo. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. John now reveals that even though Jesus had brotherly affection or filio for these 3 siblings, he also had concern for them that was far greater than physical affection. Brotherly affection or love is concern that is rooted in a close emotional attachment to a person, which prompts sympathy. It makes a person sympathetic and a desire to offer immediate aid to alleviate whatever suffering is being experienced by the one that's loved, one who is in need of help. That's filio. That's brotherly concern. Godly love, or agapeo, is concern that is rooted in the eternal well-being of an individual. It goes way beyond brotherly affection. It's about the eternal well-being. Verse 6, so, because he did have agapeo for the 3, when he heard that he, Lazarus, was sick, he, Jesus, stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. It was due to his godly love for Lazarus, Martha, and Mary that he purposely did not immediately go and fulfill their request to come to him. Now, it was also because of his godly love that he did not simply heal Lazarus as he had healed the servant of the centurion. In that case, remember Matthew recorded that Jesus simply, the centurion says, look, I give orders and they're done. I don't have to go there. You can just give the order. And Jesus admired his faith. What incredible faith that this Roman centurion has. And so, he just gave the word and from where he was, and the servant was healed from a distance. And so he could have done the same thing with Lazarus, but he didn't do that. No, because of his agapeo, he didn't do so. His delay by not immediately returning to Bethany would provide the most profound way to teach them the importance of faith in him in order to receive eternal life. And that would happen when he performed the greatest sign of his ministry. Now, since he and the disciples were staying in the area, we saw last time in chapter 10, here in verse 40, almost at the end of the chapter, they were staying in the area that John the Baptist began his ministry of baptizing. They were likely, I believe, to be the further distance of the second, or the other Bethany, which was about between 50 and 60 miles north of Bethany, here outside of Jerusalem. Verse 7, then after this he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, lately, or as the Complete Jewish Bible brings out a little clearer here, a short while ago, so basically 5 or 6 weeks ago, 4 or 5 weeks ago, the Jews sought to stone you. And are you going there again? The disciples, we find here, were very reluctant about returning to Judea and possibly encountering the hostile religious leaders again. It had only, again, been 4, maybe up to 6 weeks since the last confrontation with the Pharisees at the Feast of Dedication, and before that, at the Feast of Tabernacles, a couple of months prior to that. So the last 2 times they've been in Judea, they were going to stone Jesus. So the disciples knew, it hadn't been very long, a little over a month maybe, that the hatred of the Pharisees had not diminished in any respect. They were still going to be very hostile if Jesus showed up. So they questioned the soundness of the decision that Jesus had made. We're going to go back. Let's go back. Verse 9, Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day, or 12 hours of daylight, as the Revised English Bible and I think a couple other translations bring out? Jesus seems to prepare the disciples for correction by first alluding to the allotted time that he was given by the Father to perform his ministry, symbolized by 12 hours of daylight. That time set by the Father, which we find in numerous places back in chapter 2, chapter 7, I think chapter 8, his hour. Remember, that's how it's, my hour has not yet come. Here in chapter 2, remember Mary said, well, would you change the water to wine? My time, my hour is not yet. But again, that's the allotted time. My hour is the allotted time given to him by the Father. That hour, that time was not yet due to expire. He still had other things to do. He had other works to perform to complete the will of the Father, and one of those things, one of those works, required returning to Bethany at that time. Verse 9 goes on. Are there not 12 hours in the day or daylight? If anyone walks in the day, during the daylight, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. Or, the Revised English Bible has this world's light to see by. But I think Jesus definitely was talking about the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him, or is not with him. He has no light, Goodspeed translates it. Jesus responds to the fears of the disciples that he will be leading them into a death trap if they go back to Judea by using an allegory here to remind them of who he is. He is the light of the world. And he has already tied that into being the Son of God and the messenger who's been sent by the Father. He is the light of the world. As long as they walk with him, trusting the path that he chooses, they have absolutely nothing to fear. They do not have to fear death. They do not have to fear death. It is only if they choose, if his disciples choose to walk without him, without being with the light of the world, by questioning or by doubting his decisions, that they will stumble and have much to fear. They will have a reason to fear death. Verse 11, these things he said, and after that he said to them, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. Now, Jesus knew the very moment that Lazarus had died. Because, again, he was omniscient. He was aware of all things. He purposely, however, waited until Lazarus died before stating his intention to go back to Bethany. Verse 12, the New American Standard translates, "The disciples therefore said to him, 'Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover.'" Now, Jesus had spoken of his death by using the term sleep, which the Bible uses in many places. But the disciples thought that he was speaking of literal sleep. The disciples knew, as we do today, that sleep helps the body to recuperate from sickness or illness. The body needs to shut down in order for various processes to take place. And so they understood that. So they felt that it would be foolish of them to risk their lives in a situation where recovery was imminent. If he's sleeping, he's going to be okay. Verse 14. Then Jesus said to them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him." Had Jesus immediately gone to Lazarus when Martha and Mary had sent a messenger to let him know about the situation, he would have healed him in the same fashion that he had healed the hundreds or thousands, or we don't know how many healings he did, but I would say in the thousands, be my guess, in the 3.5-year ministry, of other sick people that he had healed during his ministry. He would have done the same thing there. The primary objective of what was to occur was for the sake. He says, "For your sakes." It was for the sake of the disciples of Jesus, not just for the disciples then, but for his disciples of all time. All who would eventually be selected to follow him. Verse 16, "Then Thomas, who is called Didymus," the New Revised Standard simply translates Didymus as the twin. That's what it means, the twin. "Who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, 'Let us also go, that we may die with him.'" Didymus is a literal translation of the Hebrew word for twin into the Greek. He was possibly, we've kind of surmised that from time to time, he's possibly the twin of Matthew, since he is normally associated with Matthew in the lists of the disciples. He was always teamed up with Matthew. And so you kind of look at, well, Peter, Andrew, it kind of makes sense. James, John, okay, brothers. And maybe he was just a brother, but he was a twin, so maybe he was a twin brother, whatever. Now we find his statement here. Thomas's statement reveals that he, and maybe all the rest of the disciples, failed to understand the allegory that Jesus had used about doubting his decisions here in verses 9 and 10. If you walk with the light of the world, you have nothing to fear. But they didn't quite get it, because he didn't say, come right out and say, as long as you're with me, you don't have to anything to worry about. He didn't say that. He gave an allegory, and it seemed to went right over their heads. Now, Thomas's reaction also reveals that he was influenced by a cynical attitude, which surfaces again later, as we know, back in chapter 20. We'll get to that later on. But, unless I put my finger here, unless I see this for myself, again, we call him Thomas the Doubter or whatever, but he was more cynical than he was. I got to see this with my own eyes. Anyway, verse 17. "So, when Jesus came, he found that he, Lazarus, had already been dead, or had already been in the tomb 4 days. It's reasonable to conclude that Jesus left the area where John the Baptist began his ministry on the day that Lazarus died, because he told the disciples, he is dead. Okay, now it's time to go. He is dead. So it's reasonable to say they left on the day he died. The distance is 50 to 60 miles again, as I speculated back here in verse 6, because the speculation is, well, they were about 20 miles away on the other side of Jericho, or it could be they were up, 12, 15 miles south of the Sea of Galilee, because there's speculation, well, John baptized down here, or John baptized up there. They don't really know. I think it was up north. Makes more sense. Everything fits in this way. They leave on the day he died. They got 4 days to travel. The distance of 50 to 60 miles would require about 4 days travel by foot. And that's the way they traveled. Now, the dead, I should say the unembalmed dead, were buried or entombed on the day they died. The pharaohs, of course. And today they embalm the bodies, and as a result, nobody notices that they're decaying and rotting away. And in that day and time, they didn't do that. It was costly. And so when somebody died, within a few hours, things began to smell. So they put them in the ground, or they put them in the tomb right away. So he'd been in the tomb 4 days from the day he died till then. Verse 18, now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away. Bethany was close enough to Jerusalem that many relatives and acquaintances of Lazarus and Martha and Mary, who lived in the much larger city, would have come to pay their respects to the two sisters. Okay, and of course that means people would be going back and forth over the course of a number of days, actually probably about a week is what the normal was. This meant that the religious leaders in Jerusalem would quickly learn of Jesus' arrival and probably attempt to arrest him again, as they had already attempted back at the Feast of Dedication and even at the Feast of Tabernacles, last great day. Verse 19, and many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him. But Mary was sitting, or King James says she sat still in the house. She remained. The Jewish custom was to sit in mourning for 7 days at the death of an immediate family member. Hence, we find Mary observing this custom. However, in keeping with her impetuous nature, Martha bolted out of the house, leaving all of the official mourning duties to her sister Mary. Verse 21, then Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Martha knew well that Jesus could heal. She had no doubt witnessed many such things and was greatly disappointed that he had not arrived in time to heal her brother before he died. Verse 22, but even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. As close as she and her siblings were to Jesus, she was no doubt aware of Jesus restoring the life of the daughter of Jairus and the son of the widow at Nain, which are recorded in Matthew, I think, and Luke's accounts. However, both of those individuals were restored to life within hours, before their bodies were ever buried or entombed. Lazarus had been dead for over 4 days. So his body was already in the process of decaying. Yet Martha, thought that maybe if he decided to appeal to the Father, if you'll just turn to God and you ask him on my behalf, that Lazarus might be restored to life by God. Maybe that would happen. Martha's suggestion reveals that she still at that point had not yet grasped that Jesus was God. She didn't grasp that. She saw him only as a very important prophet. Maybe she saw him as the prophet there in Deuteronomy 18, a prophet that was incapable of doing any work on his own. That's how she viewed him, that he was simply the tool through which God worked. But God had to do it. Jesus himself couldn't. Therefore, she did not directly ask Jesus to raise her brother. But if you'll talk to God, maybe he'll do it. Verse 23, Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Martha was well aware of the resurrection from scriptures like Daniel 12:2. And as far as that goes, we don't know from Acts chapter 23 that the Pharisees were very much understanding of the resurrection. They used that to get Jesus, to lambast the Sadducees. And they praised him for lambasting the Sadducees because they didn't believe in a resurrection. So, she was aware of the resurrection. Now, the term "the last day," the resurrection at the last day, that was a term that Jesus used in his teaching back, when he fed the 5,000 and so on, back in chapter 6. He used that term about the resurrection of the just that would be at the last day. Therefore, the term "the last day" refers to the time when the seventh day of 1,000 years begins, at the seventh trump. That's the last day. It begins then. Now, it goes on and on and on and on forever. Never ends. That day does not end. The day of the Lord also includes not only that, the return of Jesus Christ at the seventh trump, but it includes the dissolution of all of the material universe. Everything reverts back to spirit. That's also, we saw that in 2 Peter chapter 3. Verse 25, Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life." I am the resurrection and the life. Resurrection, which is release from death or deliverance from death, and life, which is full consciousness with the ability to fulfill conscious thought. Put them together, what are they? They're salvation. They're salvation. Resurrection and life is salvation. And the only means to salvation is Jesus Christ. Acts 4:12, only name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. Salvation or deliverance from death by a resurrection can occur whenever Jesus decides to grant that resurrection. That's when it happens, when he decides, because he's the Savior. The Father appointed him as the Savior. Verse 25 continues, "I'm the resurrection and life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live," or shall live again. "And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." Do you believe this? Jesus states here that whoever believes that he is the Savior and conforms to his instructions and follows him, whatever path he walks, walking with the light of the world, will not die forever, but only experience a period of temporary unconsciousness that may last for some moments, days, weeks, months, some thousands of years, as Moses will be able to tell us. But it's all it is. It's unconsciousness. It's like going to sleep and waking up after a night. Lazarus was a believer. He believed Jesus. And what Jesus was about to do for Lazarus was a physical example of the spiritual reality that will occur at the time of the first resurrection, the resurrection of the righteous. Verse 27, she, Martha, said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God who has come into the world. Now, Martha stressed here her steadfast belief that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. She used the term who is to come into the world. He who is to come, or he that comes, was one of the titles. He who comes was a title that was used by the Jews in referring to the Messiah. He who comes, and this is what she says, who is to come. So she is using that to emphasize her belief of who he was. She also believed that he was the Son of God. But you know what? David was the Son of God. Others were sons of God. He was the Son of God who came bearing the message of the Father. She does not claim here the belief that he is also God. She doesn't say that. I don't believe. She doesn't say, I believe you are God. I believe you're the Son of God. You've been sent by God. But she didn't see him as she needed to see him. Not yet. Verse 28, Revised English Bible. So saying, she went to call her sister Mary, and taking her aside, or as Goodspeed has, and I believe is more accurate, and whispering to her, she said, the Master is here and is asking for you. As soon as Mary heard this, she rose and went to him. Being acutely aware of the need to keep Jesus' arrival secret for as long as possible due to the hostility of the Pharisees, Martha spoke very privately to Mary so that other people in the room would not hear. Verse 30. Now Jesus had not yet come into the town, so he was still outside Bethany somewhere. He was in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and comforting her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, followed her, saying, she is going to the tomb to weep there. Jesus stayed outside of the village in order to conceal, obviously, his presence in Judea for as long as possible to prevent any action on the part of the hostile Pharisees to have him arrested. Verse 32. Then, when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. She was no doubt bawling as she did this, as no doubt her sister Martha had been earlier. She expressed the same conviction that Martha had when she first met Jesus. Like Martha, Mary had confidence in what Jesus could do for the living. He can heal the living. She was confident in that. She knew it, but she did not fully comprehend the most important thing that Jesus can do, which is for the dead. For the dead, because he can give them life again. Verse 33, therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit, or he was deeply moved, some translations have, and was troubled or deeply distressed. And he said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. And then we have verse 35, the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. John includes this instance to show once again that Jesus was fully human, both physically and emotionally. He was human. However, he did not weep here because of hopelessness or the feeling of loss, as did Mary and Martha and all of the other people that were there to mourn. The emotion he expressed, he wept. The emotions that he expressed here were deep compassion and sympathy for the grief and the despair being experienced by those people who had assembled. Because for them, they saw no hope. He was dead. They would never see him again. At least not in this life. for those who believed in the resurrection sometime way off in the future. Jesus, back in Hebrews, Paul tells us in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, where he's talking about our high priest, which is Jesus Christ. He says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses." Now, those weaknesses, again, that lead us to sin or whatever he experienced, those pulls, but he mastered them. He never let them get anywhere. But it's also our weakness when it comes to emotions, because we give into things emotionally we don't have to. And so he can sympathize. And we see here, he wept. He can sympathize. He can sympathize with the pain and the suffering that people experience. Going on in chapter 11, verse 36, then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" And some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying?" Those who questioned why he had failed to prevent Lazarus from dying were possibly a few of those who were actually hostile toward him. In the case of some spies sent by the Pharisees just to see what's going on there. Verse 38, then Jesus again, groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, and the sister of him who was dead, said to him, "Lord, by this time there's a stench, for he has been dead 4 days." In order to prevent inadvertently burying or entombing someone alive, the Jews had a practice of returning to a tomb for up to 3 days after death, to make certain, absolutely certain, that entombed person had not regained consciousness. Because that does happen sometimes. People, they thought, they open a casket and it's been scratched on the inside because somebody had not actually been dead. They died, but not when they thought they had died. Okay, they were in a very deep whatever, and the heartbeat almost, they couldn't even feel the heartbeat or breath or whatever. So, but anyway, they used to have little strings back in the Northeast, early on, back, I guess, the 1600s and whatever, and, they had this pipe so that if there's somebody that was buried, they could ring the bell and they could hear it and dig them out, hopefully, before they suffocated. But, again, this was something they actually did back then. 3 days, they would go and check to see. If they heard somebody yelling and screaming, "Get me out of here," they would have to open the tomb up. But if not, then that's the way it was. Martha, obviously, had given up all hope because the 3-day limit had already passed. This was already day 4. There was absolutely no question in anyone's mind, of all of those people who were there, that Lazarus was indeed dead. Nobody could question that he was dead. Earlier, again, in his ministry, when Jesus had raised those 2 individuals who we mentioned earlier, the son of the widow from Nain and the daughter of Jairus, the synagogue ruler, neither of them had been dead for 4 days. The daughter of Jairus, maybe not even an hour, it hadn't been long anyway, and the son of the widow at Nain, again, they were taking the body out to bury it, so he had died within hours probably, but none of them for 4 days. Verse 40, Jesus said to her, Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? That is, believe what? Believe that he is the resurrection and the life. If you would believe that I'm the Savior, you would see something. Jesus now tells Martha that his pronouncement of being the resurrection and the life, back up here in verse 25, was about to be fulfilled. You're about to see this with your own eyes. By resurrecting Lazarus, it should be made clear to Martha and to all who believed that Jesus was God and that he had displayed the glory of God when he resurrected this man Lazarus. Because only God can raise the dead. Only God. Verse 41, then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me, and I know that you always hear me. But because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me. Jesus had already been assured by the Father that raising Lazarus was within the scope of his will. Jesus had no doubt, before Lazarus died, prayed to the Father and said, please give me the permission to raise him from the dead, and I will wait until he dies. And so this is what happened. Jesus now audibly addresses the Father so that all who were there would know that Jesus was acting on his own on behalf of the Father. Verse 43. Now, when he had said these things, he cried with a loud voice, or he called out in a loud voice, Goodspeed says, Lazarus, come forth. And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave cloths, or strips of linen, some translations have, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, loose him, or unbind him, and let him go. Jesus proved he had authority over death, and therefore was a God by this extraordinary event. Verse 45, then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and who had seen the things Jesus did believed in him, some King James, on him. More of the people became convinced of his messiahship after witnessing this event. He was unlike any prophet that had ever appeared. But, verse 46, some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things Jesus did. In addition to the majority of those in the crowd who believed in Jesus' connection to God, were men who were hostile toward him. They were loyalists to the Pharisees, who were more interested in gaining the favor of the Pharisees or the Sanhedrin than believing a connection existed between Jesus and God. The fact that hostile witnesses admitted that Jesus had resurrected Lazarus added to the reality of the greatest miracle that Jesus had performed during his entire physical ministry. God used hostile people. Why are hostile people going to say something that's not true when it comes to reporting it? He raised him from the dead. Just like later on, the Apostle Paul, who was the greatest enemy, who was trying to wipe out the church? Saul of Tarsus. He was trying to do it, and what did God do? God struck him down, said, okay, now that you've proven how hostile, I'm going to introduce you to my son. And you know what? You're going to witness for him the remainder of your life. Who better is a witness as one who has been your enemy, has tried to destroy you, and now is willing to lay his life down on your account? Most impressive witness that we have in the New Testament. In verse 47, then the chief priests and Pharisees gathered a council, or Moffat better brings out, called a meeting of the Sanhedrin, and said, what shall we do? For this man works many signs. As a group, they still consider Jesus to be only a man. This man works many signs. They could not dispute the fact that he had performed many miracles, but they refused to credit any of those miracles as originating with God. Verse 48, if we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and the nation. Now, there are translations like the Complete Jewish Bible that insert here both our temple, or rather, both the temple, New English translation, the sanctuary, the New Revised Standard, the holy place, and nation. They are incorrect, frankly. These translators and some of the others have interpreted the Greek word for place to mean the temple. But the clear connection of our place is to we. If we let him do this, our place. See, you connect what's going on here. The we here is a reference to the chief priests and the Pharisees, and therefore the greatest support for place is referring to position or office. Our position, it's going to be taken away from us. And here we find that after word of the resurrection of Lazarus was spread around, they were sure, the council, the Sanhedrin, they were sure a groundswell of popular support would prompt the people to proclaim Jesus as the Messiah and their king. Remember what happened back up on the northeast side of the Lake of Galilee, Sea of Galilee, when Jesus had fed everybody. Okay, they were about to take him and make him king. They were thinking he was the Messiah. This action, of course, would bring down the wrath of Rome. The nation would suffer massive retribution for rebellion, and the place or the position of authority held by the members of the Sanhedrin, that would be stripped from them for allowing the people to organize and revolt. And so that's what they were worried about. Verse 49, and one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year. Now, Caiaphas was high priest from AD 18 up until, I think it was in the year 36 when he was replaced. But anyway, for 18 years or so, 18, 19 years, he was high priest. John may have used this term that year to allude to the practice of the Romans of appointing the high priesthood to a man of their choosing. And they generally rotated the high priest pretty frequently because they had good reason probably to do that. Even though the office of high priest had been instituted as hereditary from the outset of the Aaronic priesthood, during the time of the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes, when he ruled Judea, he started the practice. He began the practice of selling the office of high priest to whatever priest among the descendants of Aaron would give him the most money. So he auctioned off the position. And that went on all through his reign. Once Herod the Great came to power, once Rome gave him the kingship over all of that area, he installed a new high priest whenever he wanted to. After the death of Herod the Great, the Roman governors continued his practice because they believed, again, if a man in that office with all of that power were to be allowed to stay there very long, he would become way too powerful. And he might then rebel against Rome. So we can't allow that to happen. The only reason Caiaphas held the position for as long as he did was due to his shrewdness and the way he dealt with the Romans. He knew how to appease them and, put money in their pockets and do things that they were willing to allow him to stay. That's just the way it was. Caiaphas was evil, evil, evil. We've covered him before, some of the evilness. Maybe a little later on in John, we'll hit some of that again. Verse 49 goes on, Caiaphas said to them, "You know nothing at all, for nor do you consider that it is expedient, or much better, Lamsa says, for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation, or all the people, Lamsa again, should perish." Caiaphas was not intentionally prophesying that Jesus was the Messiah who would die for the sins of the people. Rather, Caiaphas was stating that it would be much better for Jesus to die than hundreds, thousands of Jews there in Jerusalem and throughout Judea, which would happen if the Romans were required to stop a Messiah from leading a revolt against Rome. His motive for saying so was entirely selfish because he cared nothing at all for the people. He only cared about retaining his powerful position and all of the affluent lifestyle that he was used to. So, no, he cared nothing at all for the people. Now, verse 51 through 52 is parenthetical. Goodspeed brings this out. Now, he was not self-motivated in saying this, but as high priest for that year, he was inspired to say, or he prophesied, the King James, New King James says, he prophesied that Jesus was to die for the nation. And not only for the nation, but also for the purpose of uniting the scattered children of God. So, again, this is another parenthetical insertion placed here by John to show that God used this corrupt high priest to make a prophecy that Jesus would fulfill the messianic prophecy back in Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53:6 tells us there where the Eternal laid on him, his servant, the iniquity of us all. And so this is basically what this is. This is, again, you read it and it's focusing back on that messianic prophecy. Now, the scattered children of God refers to all who will eventually be brought into the family of God. Those who are scattered from or cut off from God at this time due to sin. That's why they're scattered. Sin. They're cut off by sin. The term scattered children of God can refer either to the church or it can refer to all of humanity. The church was created after Jesus assumed his position at the right hand of the Father in heaven and sent his Spirit to each member. Day of Pentecost, remember? The Spirit was sent to each. Humanity's connection with God and the tree of life was destroyed through sin. Jesus' death made atonement of sin possible so that mankind can be reconciled and united with God and be added to, remember, the one flock. The one flock of the shepherd. Going back to chapter 10, I think about verse 16 or 17. There will be one flock. I've got more sheep that are not in this pen, but eventually it's all going to be one fold, one flock, and one shepherd. And so they're all going to be brought together. They're scattered sheep, but they're all going to be in the flock, no longer scattered. Verse 53, then from that day on they plotted to put him to death. Therefore, Jesus no longer walked openly or appeared in public, as Moffat brings out, among the Jews, but went from there into the country near the wilderness to a city called Ephraim, and there remained with his disciples. Now this Ephraim was probably, they're not absolutely certain which Ephraim, there were several towns called Ephraim, but probably the one located a few miles northeast of Bethel, which of course lay north of Jerusalem. It was on the edge of the Judean wilderness, or desert, which made it a very good place from which to escape if the Sanhedrin sent an armed escort to go up to Ephraim and try to arrest and take Jesus back to Jerusalem. So they were at that point. Now we're not told, again, John doesn't give us any elapse of time, doesn't tell us how long this followed something else. So we're not told the length of time that he and his disciples continued or remained there. It just says they remained there. For how long? A day? 2 days? 3 days? A week? How long was it? Based on the synoptic accounts, the duration had to have been fairly short. Matthew's account indicates that Jesus' final trip to Jerusalem began in Galilee. That's where it began. Matthew chapter 19, beginning of chapter 19, they were in Galilee, which means that Jesus and the 12 probably went directly back to Galilee from Ephraim, from this particular town. Luke's account states that he initially, when they left Galilee, headed south, due south, to a village of the Samaritans. But when the Samaritans found out that he wasn't coming to Samaria in order to keep the Passover with them at Mount Gerizim, then they unwelcomed him. And so they had to turn eastward. And then they, according to Mark's account anyway, they went over to the east side of the Jordan and then traveled south on the east side of the Jordan. Of course, that would be through Perea. I think Mark chapter 10 is where that is. Matthew makes clear that many family members and other pilgrims accompanied Jesus and the 12, and that Jesus taught and he healed people as they passed through the various towns through Perea. All of that is in Matthew chapters 19 and 20. That summarizes all of what took place there. All of these things that we read about in the Synoptics would require the Galilee to Jerusalem pilgrimage to last definitely more than a week, possibly as much as 2 weeks. And so they could not have stayed at Ephraim for too terribly long, because Passover that year was in the first week of April. Okay. Verse 55. And the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went from the country up to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves, or to perform the purification ceremony, as the complete Jewish Bible has. All who were ritually unclean because of various defilements had to be purified or ceremonially cleansed before keeping the Passover. For example, the cleansing that was required of those who had been defiled by touching a dead body took 7 days. Numbers chapter 9 and chapter 19 have various, gives you the outline of how long it would take for certain things to be done in order to be ritually pure to be able to keep the Passover. This means that many people, dozens, hundreds, thousands, we're not told, arrived in Jerusalem more than a week before Passover. Because if it takes 7 days to be clean, you got to be there, you got to be clean before, it's time to take the Passover. Verse 56. Then they sought Jesus and spoke among themselves. That is, this big crowd that came. They spoke among themselves as they stood in the temple or the temple courts. What do you think? That he will not come to the feast? Now, both the chief priests and the Pharisees, which means the Sanhedrin, had given a command that if anyone knew where he was, he should support it. He should report it, that they might seize or arrest him. Even though most of the people, as we see here, were anxiously anticipating Jesus' arrival based on their knowledge of the arrest warrant, preferably wanted alive, not dead or alive. They wanted to put him to death. But this arrest warrant that was out, that was the religious leaders or the Sanhedrin put out, some of the people who had arrived early for purification sincerely doubted that Jesus would come. He's got too much to lose because these people are hostile. And the word is spread all through the city. If you see this guy, you report it immediately. So, he probably isn't going to come. We'd love to see him. We heard all about him raising Lazarus from the dead, but, it's wise. The wise thing for him to do is stay out of town. Verse 1 of chapter 12. Then, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, who had been dead, whom he, Jesus, had raised from the dead. According to Matthew 20, verse 29, Jesus and his disciples came to Jerusalem, up to Jerusalem, from Jericho. Again, not Ephraim, from Jericho. Since their arrival was 6 days before the day of the Passover, they had to have arrived in Bethany after sunset on Wednesday, the 8th day of Nisan. That's the day they had to arrive, Nisan 8. Verse 2, there they made him a supper, and Martha served. But Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. There would be a similar supper in Bethany in 4 days, on the evening, on Sunday evening, Nisan 12. Totally separate. And it would be at the house of Simon the leper. We're told about that both in Matthew 26 and I think Mark chapter 14. So that was a different, all of the commentators, this is the same thing. No, it's not. We're told this was 6 days before, and it's very clear when you read those accounts that it had to be Sunday night. So it's two separate events, regardless of what they may think in their wisdom. Verse 3, then Mary took a pound, Complete Jewish Bible says, a whole pint, which Complete Jewish Bible got it right because we're talking of liquid here, we're not talking of solids. Pints a pound, the world around. So anyway, pound, of course, is going to be solid. The pint is going to be liquid. And this is liquid. Very costly oil, liquid, of spikenard. Anointed, she took it and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. Now, at the Sunday evening supper, an unnamed woman brought an expensive perfume. We're not told what kind it was. And it says there that she poured the oil over Jesus' head. Not on his feet, but on his head. This was no doubt done because she had either heard about or had actually been present at this particular supper herself to witness what Mary had done this very evening. And so Mary had done the feet. This woman's going to do his head. So we have two separate events. Okay, verse 4, then one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii, or 300 silver coins, as the New English translation has, and given to the poor? Now, this sum that's given here, 300 denarii, was equal to a laborer's annual salary. That's what his yearly wages would be. It's basically 300. And is so translated, or at least indicated, in a number of other translations, like the Complete Jewish Bible, New Living, and a couple of others. Verse 6, this he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, or the New Living Translation, he had charge of the disciples' money. He had the money bags. And he used to take what was put in it. So he dipped into the fund. Jesus recognized this moral failing in Judas early on, which is the likely reason he was chosen to be one of the 12. To be a thief, one must be extremely secretive and greedy. Two important qualifications for a thief, which are the same traits, the same identical traits that are present in a traitor. A traitor is one who is willing to deceive, be very secretive, and sell out his friends because of greed. So a thief would be the perfect one to choose as a traitor. Verse 7, then Jesus said, let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. For the poor you have with you always, but me you do not have always. Again, just like the tomb. Here, Mary has oil that's worth an entire year's wages. So Lazarus, Martha, Mary were not the poor. They were among the more wealthy. Jesus reminded Judas here of Deuteronomy, what we have is 15 verse 11, that states what God states about the endless poor. The poor you will have with you always. Because there are going to be some people who just cannot learn how to manage money. And so it's going to be that way. Here, Jesus commended Mary's selfless act of love toward him, the exact opposite of the action that Judas was about to take against him in a matter of days. Verse 9, then a great many of the Jews knew that he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. Now, this event probably took place on the daylight portion of Thursday, Nisan 8. This would be in keeping with the fact that it was reported that Jesus arrived and had supper in Bethany, so the next day at daylight, all these people, by the time word got back to Jerusalem, they're planning to come see for themselves the two individuals. Verse 10, but the chief priests took counsel that they might also put Lazarus to death, because on account of him, many of the Jews went away, or the New Living Translation, had deserted them and believed on Jesus. The chief priests wanted to destroy any lasting evidence of the miracles that Jesus had worked, so that the people would forget him much more quickly. And then once they would forget about him, then they would finally kick the dirt and turn around and come back once again, submitting themselves to the religious leadership of the Sanhedrin. And so that is why they wanted to kill Lazarus. And that brings us to where we have the necessary need to stop, because the next section is very lengthy.